Good evening. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director of the Redwood Library, and I want to welcome you to this evening's presentation. This is one of the lectures that we are presenting as part of this year's Black History Month. And as always, we're thrilled to have Dr. Ed Markward take us through another one of his amazing lectures. This one is devoted to William Grant Still, the first classically trained African-American composer in America. So without further ado, welcome, and here is Dr. Markward.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and share with you some thoughts and some material and some pieces by William Grant Still, the Dean of African American Composers. Dr. Still was born in 1895 in Woodville, Mississippi. His parents were teachers and musicians, and they were of African, Indian, Spanish, Irish, and Scotch bloodlines. After the death of his father, when William Grant Still was still an infant, his mother moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, where she taught school, and that's where William Grant Still grew up. Into his teens, he taught himself at a very early age to play several instruments, among them the violin and the oboe. And the oboe becomes important later on because he played that instrument in several professional orchestras. He attended Wilberforce University, which is a historically Black college and university in Ohio. As a matter of fact, it's the nation's oldest privately run by Black folks. It was founded in 1856. And he took non-music courses there, but spent much time arranging and conducting music for the band on that campus. He then went to the Oberlin Conservatory, where his education was interrupted for 2 years when he joined the Navy and fought for the U.S. in World War II. In that time, people of color were only allowed in the service to work in the food service. But they discovered that he played, so he spent his evenings not in the kitchen, but playing the violin and the oboe for the officers on deck of the ship. Here's what Edith Boroff, one of our great musicologists who taught at the University of Eastern Michigan for many years, has to say about William Grant Still. He was very much a person of his own time and his own place, as were many composers, I'm sure. There were 3 phases of his career. We find so many composers whose output is split into 3 sections, most notably Beethoven, I suppose. But this is a little different because he had to make a living and in these 3 phases of his career. The first was training and an apprenticeship where he received instruction from W.C. Handy, the great blues composer, and also from George Chadwick. You may remember George Chadwick was one of the Boston 6 romantic American composer who was the head of the New England Conservatory for quite a period of time. So Still studied with W.C. Handy and indeed arranged for Handy's orchestra, and also studied with George Chadwick in Boston, Massachusetts, where he was playing with an orchestra called Shuffle Along, and we will talk about that in a few moments. The second phase was in New York, and he had 2 lives in New York. He was a performing professional musician in the popular bands of the day. He arranged popular music, but he pursued his career as a serious classical composer as well. And the last phase took him to Los Angeles, where again his career was split into 2 parts, writing classical music, composing classical music, and also he made a living, supported himself by writing movie scores and works for television as well. One of the movies he made starring Frank Sinatra was Pennies from Heaven, and he wrote scores for the television series Gunsmoke and the early episodes of Perry Mason. that Still's writing, and again, this is Edith Boroff speaking, was an amalgam of African and European music, of his own heritage and the heritage of both Africa and the United States, made him, above all, an American composer. The quality of his music, along with the success of his career, with more honorary doctorates than any other composer, made Still a composer of the highest importance, not only for Black Americans, but perhaps more importantly, for all Americans. There was a point during the 1940s, 30s, late 30s and 1940s, where his serious music was the most performed of any classical composer in the United States. He entered the world, as we have just mentioned, in commercial or popular music, which was an area he used to support himself. His employers, in addition to W.C. Handy, and some of you may remember this if you're older, these people if you're old enough, Donald Voorhees, Sophie Tucker, Paul Whiteman, Willard Robinson, and Artie Shaw. And he earned his living playing the oboe in the pit band for the music Shuffle Along, which was a review. It was designed and directed and produced by Noble Sissel, and you may know the name U.B. Blake, and some of the arrangements were done by Still. This was the first show on Broadway, completely staffed and celebrated by Black musicians and charged full price Broadway ticket prices. It was the first in New York City to do so. It also ran for 504 straight performances in New York City before it went on tour. And when it went on tour to Boston, that is where Mr. Still made the acquaintance of George Chadwick. All of these studies, and in New York, he also studied with the avant-garde composer Edgar Varese. All these studies with Handy, with George Chadwick, and with Edgar Varese were all funded by scholarships. They thought so much of his talent that he never had to pay for a lesson fee. In the 20s, he made his first appearance as a serious composer in New York, and his arrival in New York City in the 20s coincided with the start and lived through what we know as the Harlem Renaissance, which included W.E.B. Du Bois, most famously Langston Hughes, I think, and also Still's second wife, who has become his second wife, Verna Arvey, who was a concert pianist. He began a friendship with Dr. Howard Hanson, and this would become very, very important in Still's life. Dr. Hanson pushed for his works to be performed, and indeed, the first performance of his African American symphony, Symphony Number 1 in A flat, was performed by the Rochester Orchestra under the conducting expertise of Dr. Hanson. He received commissions from the Columbia Broadcasting Company and the New York World's Fair in 1939 and 40. His tune was chosen from 300 blind scores that the committee went through, chose Dr. Still's score to be the theme song for the 1939 World's Fair. Dr. Still could only get in after 5:30 in the evening or during the daytime on what was called Colored Day. He also received commissions from Paul Whiteman, the League of Composers, the Cleveland Orchestra, and the Southern Conference Educational Fund. He received 8 honorary doctorates, 3 Guggenheim fellowships, and was therefore nicknamed the Dean of African American Composers. If one word could sum up his work, his life's work, as well as his compositions, it would be integration, not only of peoples and cultures, but of styles of music, principally African music and American music, or serious American music derived from European roots. I first performed, it's the only time I performed it, the African American Symphony about 20 years ago. And I spoke to a person on the phone from the William Grant Still Publishing Company in Flagstaff, Arizona. And in talking to this person, I knew that the number of performances of William Grant Still's music had dropped off considerably. And I asked this woman, was it still as difficult to get his works performed as I had read about from years earlier? And we'll see what caused this decline in performance in a little while. And she said, yes, it was. And that's why she started the publishing company. And she spent untold number of hours calling publishers, calling performing arts organizations, orchestras, conductors, you name it. She made phone calls, wrote letters, and so on. And toward the end of this conversation, I asked to whom I was speaking. And the woman on the other said, well, this is Judith Still, William Grant Still's daughter. And I'm sure at the time I just melted into a flood of tears. The African American Symphony Number 1 in A flat was given by the Rochester Philharmonic in 1931. It was written in 1930. Still said, I knew I wanted to write a symphony. I knew that it had to be an American work, and I wanted to demonstrate how the blues, so often considered a lowly expression, could be elevated on the highest musical level. There was a white American who lived roughly at the same time, although he died 30 some years earlier, by the name of George Gershwin, who you may recall was trying to elevate the jazz form into a concert idiom with orchestra. And among those big pieces that George Gershwin wrote, of course, were the two Rhapsodies, the Concerto in F, American in Paris, and the folk opera Porgy and Bess. I want you to hear one, well, we'll start with the opening of Symphony Number 1 in A flat. It sort of sets the tone for the rest of the movement, or the rest of the symphony. I think you'll find it quite attractive, and you'll see what we are talking about when we mentioned he tried to incorporate the blues into this symphony. Each of the movements of this symphony has a subtitle. The first movement here, and I think you can hear it, is Longing, Moderato assai. The second is Sorrow, Adagio. The third, Humor, Animato. And the last, Aspiration, Lento con risoluzione, with resolution. I want to play a bit of the third movement, the humorous movement. And if you listen very carefully, you will hear once we get past a couple bars of introduction, you will hear in the French horns as a counterpoint to the main melody, a little tune which goes like this. Bum, bum, ba, dum, dim, dum, da, da. See if you can hear that as we go through this. for it. Upside down. It's the same rhythm, the same notes. In 1987, Judith Ann Still, the daughter I mentioned a moment ago, wrote in a letter that Gershwin stole the song from her father. Well, I'm not sure he stole it, but my father said that Gershwin came to the Negro shows in Harlem to get his inspiration, stealing melodies wholesale, starving minority composers, and then passing them off as his own. And she suggests that I Got Rhythm was one of those tunes. George Gershwin was not the only Tin Pan Alley composer to get his inspiration in Harlem during what is known as the Harlem Renaissance. Many composers went there. As a matter of fact, a little later on, in the early 40s, my father, who was in the army at the time and was stationed in Babylon on Long Island in New York, often, along with many, many other soldiers, would go up to Harlem to the Apollo Theater and so on to hear the great bands of the time. And composers throughout time have mimicked other composers and copied them and enveloped their styles and then probably improved on them. So Gershwin was not the only one, but I think we can lend credence to Miss Still's statement that at least composers from Tin Pan Alley went to Harlem to be inspired by the composers there. I want to play a little bit of an earlier piece now. It's called Guya Blessé, and it's in 9 movements. It's a ballet. And the reason I want to, La Guya Blessé is a female witch doctor or devil, and her theme plays all the way through. This is the prelude, and the reason I'm playing this now that you've heard, or we have heard, what he did with the blues in a major symphony, we can hear before he adopted that style in the prelude to La Guya Blessée. So this ballet was composed in 1927. It received a great production in Rochester to great reviews. And then it was performed in Chicago as well. And the reviewer for the Chicago American noted, this ballet is above the average ballet music, both in quality of invention and in the value of its themes and imagination. It is a highly colored, vivid, evocative, gorgeous score. Another reviewer in Rochester wrote, the music is charming, picturesque, and dramatically suggestive, never padded, never divorced from the action, yet with an individual appeal of its own. Moving on, that one, I think I said, that was in 1927. The next piece we're going to hear is from 1935. It's called Three Visions. They're for piano, and the first we're going to hear is called "The Dark Horsemen," and I think you can hear the galloping horses as they appear in this piano work. One of the reasons that still became so popular, or what at least contributed to his popularity, um, Leopold Stokowski took on tour of the United States the fourth movement of the African American Symphony, and this tour was advertised extensively, and you can imagine how many people would flock to hear this Philadelphia orchestra under the direction of Leopold Stokowski. So that certainly had to help his reputation. He began writing piano pieces for his wife, Verna Arvey, and this is one of those pieces. In 1930, it was written in 1935. In 1934, as we discussed, he moved to Los Angeles, where he began to write for movies and for television shows, but always continuing his efforts as a serious composer. Many of his earliest works have been lost, but what have survived is between 150 and 200 classical works for various orchestrations, piano, chamber music, and we'll hear later some songs of his. His Symphony Number 2, well, as number 1 was called the African American Symphony, and he tried to describe in his subtitles and in the music soldiers after the Civil War, or the black race after the Civil War. He wrote his second Symphony Number 2 in G minor in 1937. It's called Song of a New Race, and it's for the modern African American, the modern person of color. And whereas he had subtitles for the movements in the first symphony, these are the movements of this symphony, again, 4 movements, are not. There's just slowly and deeply expressive, moderately fast, and moderately slow. You will hear, if you give these symphonies a listen, and all of this music that I'm playing tonight is readily available, other than the ones that I already owned on CD. Everything that I'm playing tonight is available to stream. There are numerous other African American traditions in this symphony: call and response, syncopation, varied repetition of short melodic ideas, jazz harmonies, and so on. As I re-listened to all of this music in the last month or so, one thing that began to impress me over and over again, no matter what the genre was, is the craftsmanship in his composition. The form of these symphonies and the other works, it's very tight. You can follow your way through with a theme, a variation, a development, a recapitulation, and all those things we associate with great compositions. This is from Symphony Number 2 in G minor. Let's listen to a slow movement from that symphony. That was moderately fast. This is moderately slow. The last movement. One other influence, I think, at least according to his daughter, on Still's music, and in addition to W.C. Handy, George Chadwick, and then the Edgar Varese influence, which was discarded after a while after trying to incorporate the blues and so on, was Harry T. Burleigh. And you may remember last year at this time we talked about the music of Harry T. Burleigh. Harry T. Burleigh, just to refresh our minds about it, was in the employ of Antonin Dvorak at the American Conservatory in New York City. You may also recall Burleigh couldn't get in as a student, so Dvorak hired him as his assistant. And it was Burleigh who sang hundreds of so-called Negro spirituals to Dvorak as they had been sung to him by his mother. This is a long way to go to say that I think Harry T. Burleigh influenced Still, but I think there's a thread in many of his pieces of Antonin Dvorak as well. Also in 1937, he composed a work called Lenox Avenue, which was for orchestra. It's 10 orchestral episodes and a finale for orchestra, chorus, and announcer. The first performance was broadcast nationally on radio on May 23rd, 1937, conducted by Howard Barlow. Some of you may remember that name from your radio days or early television days as well. And a related ballet version was composed in 1938. It's a work set in Harlem in the mid 1930s, and it's a series of scenes as William Grant Still saw them on Lenox Avenue. They include, among others, the crap game, the flirtation, the fight, the law, dance of the boys, dance of the man down south, the old man, in parentheses, the philosopher, the mission, and the movement we are going to hear, the house rent party, which includes the Lenox Avenue Blues. Unfortunately, I don't have a full orchestra version, but I think you get the idea from the piano version. Strict blues, William Grant Still. Lenox Avenue, the house rent party blues. Etc. As I mentioned, he began writing piano pieces for his wife, Verna Arvey. And here is an example of some of the pieces that he wrote for her. Excuse me, this is called Seven Traceries, which he wrote in 1939 and 40. They're very descriptive pieces, much like Debussy would write. He began to use sort of modern techniques at this point, at least for a little while. The techniques such as octonicism, an octonic scale we ran into when we talked about Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring. An octonic scale has 8 tones as opposed to our major or minor scale, which has 7. These are very impressionistic, short pieces, 7 traceries. The first one we'll hear is Cloud Cradles, and this is the one I think that resembles a bit Debussy. also from Seven Traceries, the third one of them called Muted Laughter. And the last of the traceries, a bit of wit, a bit of wit. A bit of wit from Seven Traceries. I see that Dr. Michael Paz is here, and I happen to think as I'm listening to all this music, Dr. Paz, that you perhaps were at Rhode Island College when we did the African American Symphony. Anyway, it's good to see you, so to speak. The next piece is Incantation and Dance, written in 1942. It's a chamber music work, as the next couple are. It's for piano and flute, and I'm going to start it somewhat in the middle so we can hear how he goes from the incantation part and into the dance. material of the incantation. Again, there is that European Debussy Ravel sort of influence with pentatonic and what we call the whole tone scales in that work. This particular piece, the next one, and then some of the songs that I will play for you a little bit later, have been recorded by a wonderful organization called Videmus. It was founded in 1981 by a group of musicians in Boston. It now is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the aim of the group is to present performances of people of color, women composers, and other underrepresented groups. This next work is called Suite for Violin and Piano. It was written in 1943. It's also recorded by Videmus. And I think here again, it's a bit Dvorak-like through Henry T. Burley. Back to the blues. Just a terrific piece, I think. We're going to hear a couple of things from a set called Wood Notes, which was written in 1948. Each of the four movements is a bit of a little tone poem. The first movement is called Singing River, the second Autumn Night, Moondusk, and Whippoorwill's Shoes. And if you're at all interested in this piece, the Chamber Orchestra of Barrington will be performing it as part of our Black History Month celebration on Sunday the 19th at St. John's Episcopal Church under the direction of yours truly. Here is Singing River. Sort of a demoldau effect. of the last whippoorwill's shoes. If you want to hear the rest of it, you'll have to show up on Sunday. Still was quite proud of this particular suite in that it was inspired by the poems of Joseph Mitchell Pritchard, who was a Southern white poet, and of course William Grant Still, who was a Southern composer of color. And there again, Still was quite proud of the fact that he was promoting integration. The next thing I would like to play for you is from a set of songs called Songs of Separation, again recorded by Videmus. They were composed in 1949. I think you'll find these absolutely wonderful songs and compare favorably to any of the other songs being written at the time. And I'm pleased to say that one of the founders of Videmus was the late Robert Honeysuckle, with whom Diana and I had the pleasure on several occasions of working with. He is the baritone in this performance of If You Should Go. The text is by County Cullen. Love, leave me like the light, the gently praising day. We would not know but for the night when it has slipped away. Go quietly, a dream, when done, should leave no trace that it has lived and except a gleam across the dreamer's face. And also from the same set, Songs of Separation, A Black Pierrot, text by Langston Hughes. I am a black Pierrot, she did not love me, so I crept into the night, and the night was black too. I am a black Pierrot, she did not love me, so I wept until the red dawn dropped blood over the eastern hills, and my heart was bleeding too. I am a black Pierrot, she did not love me. So with my once gay-colored soul shrunken like a balloon without air, I went forth in the morning to seek a new brown love. Tremendous singer, tremendous song. I'm going to move ahead. We're getting close to the time when we have to stop. William Grant Still composed 9 operas. It was his favorite medium to work with. He just loved writing operas. The drama appealed to him greatly. His first big opera was staged in 1949 in New York City. It was the first opera by a Black composer to be produced by an American opera company, the New York City Opera Company. And it had a sad demise. The opera is based on the 1781 revolution in the island of Haiti, where the natives overthrew the French colonials. The premiere took place 1949, March 31 in New York City. Robert Weedy, the great Robert Weedy, who also was the first to sing the title role in Frank Lesser's The Most Happy Fella, was the baritone who played Dessalines, Jacques-Jean Dessalines, the leader of the revolutionaries. The production was encouraged by New York's Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the dedication is to Leopold Stokowski. The premiere performance was greeted with 22 curtain calls. However, critical reaction to the work ranged from mixed to negative. Time magazine complained, composer Still's music, sometimes lusciously scored, sometimes naively melodic, often had more prettiness than power. In all, Troubled Island had more of the souffle of operetta than the soup bone of opera. John Briggs of the New York Post opined that one is never sure whether one is hearing a first-rate performance of a bad opera or a bad performance of a first-rate opera. While Miles Castendek, writing for both the New York Journal American and Christian Science Monitor, stated that Still's music was the result is a mixture of styles signifying talent and a feel for opera, but achieving little more than a suggestion of it. Other critics boycotted the opera and wrote their reviews in a bar, never having seen the opera. There was a meeting in William Grant Still's hotel room before the performance, and remember again, this opera received extended applause and 22 curtain calls. Howard Taubman was a critic for the New York Times, came to Still's room and said, "Billy, because I'm your friend, I think that I should tell you this. The critics have had a meeting to decide what to do about your opera. They think The Colored Boy has gone too far, and they have opted to pan your opera." And that was it. In those days, critics had that kind of influence. Following the premiere, New York City Opera staged 2 additional presentations, and to date, New York City Opera has never revived the work, and it has not been widely seen since. After it closed, it didn't get another production until 2013. After the critics had their say, The State Department withdrew the recording of the opera from all European radio stations, and performances of his other works declined as well. As you can imagine, without this kind of income from his works, he lived near poverty the last years of his life, near Southern California University. As a matter of fact, ASCAP paid the hospital bills in his later life. That's the American Society of Composers and Publishers. And the University of Southern California paid his burial fees. And as we already have spoken about, Judith Ann Still started a publishing company in Flagstaff, Arizona. These days, Still's music is getting a lot of play, as is the music of other African American composers and composers of color. In 2018, the opera was performed in Still's hometown of Woodville, Mississippi. And in 2020, the British Arts Council funded a series of performances as well. I don't have a recording, but you can listen. It's not something you can watch, but it is on YouTube. You can listen to the entire opera. I want to end tonight's discussion with what is known as the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. It was composed by James Weldon Johnson and his brother, James Weldon Johnson lives from 1781 to 1938. He wrote the poem. His brother Rosamond he wrote the music. His brother wrote the poem for a celebration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday in 1935. It was first sung by 500 children of color on a birthday of Abraham Lincoln. This is an orchestration by William Grant Still, as sung by Robert Honeysucker. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high to the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us, and so on. Robert Honeysucker, Lift Every Voice and Sing. Thank you all very, very much for coming tonight.
Every voice, lift every voice and sing till heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the darkness has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. On our wings, on our silence tears, thou who hast brought us the sorrow on the way. Thou who hast died and born, let us into the light. Keep us forever in the path we pray. Yes, our feet stray with the wine of the worldly wine.
Thank you all very much.